Hey warrior, right now, underneath everything else happening in your mind, a thought is quietly running that you never actually chose, never approved, and probably haven't even noticed yet. It arrived on its own, the way thoughts always do, uninvited and unannounced. And whether the next 10 minutes of your life feel calm or chaotic depends almost entirely on what happens to that thought in the next few seconds, not on anything actually occurring around you. Marcus Aurelius said, "The mind takes the shape of what it frequently dwells on, for the soul becomes dyed with the color of its own thoughts." An unmanaged mind becomes the very thing doing the damage long before anything outside it ever does. Most people go their entire lives without ever testing that discovery for themselves. They assume their reactions are simply who they are, anxious by nature, easily angered, prone to spiraling, without ever noticing that almost every one of those patterns is downstream of a single thought that arrived, went unexamined, and was allowed to run the rest of the day by default. There's a reason this matters more now than it ever has. The average person today is exposed to more competing claims on their attention in a single morning than people a few generations back encountered in a month. Notifications, headlines, other people's opinions delivered instantly and constantly, all of it arriving faster than most minds were ever trained to filter. Without a deliberate practice for managing your own thoughts, the loudest and most alarming ones simply win by default every single time, because nothing else was ever taught to compete with them. None of this requires becoming a different person or suppressing how you actually feel. The goal isn't a mind that no longer produces difficult thoughts. That mind doesn't exist, and chasing it just adds another layer of frustration on top of whatever was already there. The goal is a mind that's no longer ambushed by its own output, one that's built a working relationship with its own thoughts, instead of being quietly run by whichever one happens to shout the loudest on a given afternoon. 6 practices. Each one targets a different point, where thought quietly becomes suffering and shows you exactly where to intervene before that happens again. Master these in order, because each one builds the ground the next one stands on, and some of these will feel uncomfortably familiar because you'll recognize the exact thought pattern that's been running your life on autopilot for years. If you're with me on this, type "I govern my mind" right now before you keep watching. Practice 1. Catch the thought before it catches you. Most people don't realize they're having a thought until they're already 3 minutes deep inside the emotional consequences of it. The anger is already in their chest. The dread is already tightening their stomach. By the time they notice anything happening, the thought has already done its damage and quietly slipped away, leaving only the feeling behind as evidence. Epictetus taught his students to develop what he called prosophe, a kind of constant, gentle attention turned toward your own mind, watching thoughts the way a guard watches a gate, not suppressing them, not fighting them, just noticing them the instant they cross the threshold, before they've had time to recruit a mood and an entire afternoon's worth of behavior. This sounds almost too simple to matter, and that's exactly why most people skip past it looking for something more dramatic. But the entire architecture of emotional suffering depends on a thought going unnoticed long enough to feel like reality instead of like a passing mental event. The moment you catch it, really catch it, the way you'd catch a name tag and read it before deciding how to respond to the person wearing it, it loses a huge percentage of its power immediately just from being seen. Modern cognitive therapy calls this metacognitive awareness, and it's one of the most consistently effective tools researchers have found for interrupting anxious and depressive thought spirals. The skill isn't complicated, it's just rare, because almost nobody was ever taught to practice it deliberately. You weren't handed a manual for your own mind at birth. You're being handed part of one right now. Start today with a simple habit. A few times throughout the day, stop and ask yourself what you're actually thinking about in this exact moment. Not what you're doing, what you're thinking while you're doing it. Most people are shocked the first week at how much of their inner narration is negative, repetitive, and almost entirely unnoticed until someone asks them to look directly at it. Epictetus said, "Watch your impressions the way a sentinel watches the gate. Nothing should be allowed past unnoticed." The danger isn't the thought itself. Thoughts are cheap. Your brain produces thousands of them a day, most contradictory, most forgettable. The danger is an unnoticed thought operating your nervous system like a puppet while you remain convinced you're simply in a bad mood for no particular reason. This practice gets easier with repetition, the same way a muscle does. The first few times you catch a spiraling thought mid-flight, it'll feel like an accident. After a few weeks, it starts to feel like a reflex. Eventually, the noticing happens almost before the thought has finished forming. And that's the exact moment this entire system of mind control starts working in your favor instead of against you. There's a useful way to think about why this single skill carries so much weight. Every other practice on this list depends on first noticing that a thought is happening. You can't question a verdict you never noticed you accepted. You can't pause before a reaction you didn't catch forming. Practice 1 isn't just the first item on a list. It's the doorway every other practice has to walk through, which is exactly why it's worth treating as a daily habit rather than a one-time insight you nod along to and then forget by lunch. One more thing worth knowing before you move on. This skill compounds faster than almost anything else on this list. The first week you might catch a spiraling thought once a day, usually after it's already done some damage. By the second month, the catch happens earlier and earlier in the sequence, closer to the very first flicker of the thought, until eventually you're intercepting things before they've had any real chance to take hold of your mood at all. Nobody warns you how fast this particular skill accelerates once it actually starts working. If you're looking for the simplest possible version of this practice to start with today, try this. Set 3 random alarms on your phone throughout the day, and when each one goes off, pause for 10 seconds and simply ask what thought was running before the alarm interrupted it. No judgment, no analysis, just identification. After a week of this, most people report being startled by patterns they'd never have noticed otherwise. The same 3 or 4 thoughts quietly recurring dozens of times a day without ever once being consciously acknowledged. There's also a quiet confidence that comes from this practice that's easy to underestimate until you've actually experienced it. Once you trust that you can catch a difficult thought before it runs the show, a strange thing happens to your relationship with uncertainty in general. You stop needing every circumstance in your life to go perfectly because you've already proven to yourself repeatedly that you can meet whatever shows up in your own head without being knocked over by it. That kind of confidence isn't borrowed from good days. It's earned entirely from this one small, repeatable habit. Comment, "I catch my thoughts," if you just realized how much of your day runs on autopilot. Practice 2. Question the verdict, not just the event. Something happens. Within half a second, your mind has already attached a verdict to it. This is a disaster. This means they don't respect me. This proves I'm not good enough. The event and the verdict arrive together so fast that most people never separate the two, and they spend the rest of the day reacting to the verdict as if it was simply a fact reported by reality itself. Epictetus drew the clearest line in ancient philosophy between these two things. He said, "It isn't events that disturb people, it's their judgments about events. Lose a sum of money, and the loss is one thing. The story that follows, that you're careless, that you'll never recover, that this proves something permanent about your character, is an entirely separate production, manufactured in real time by your own mind, and almost never examined for accuracy." Marcus Aurelius said, "Take away the complaint. I have been harmed, and the harm itself is taken away." The practice here is deceptively simple. Every time you notice a strong emotional reaction, go back and find the verdict hiding underneath the event. Someone didn't respond to your message. The event is exactly that. No response yet. The verdict you probably attached without noticing might be, "They're angry with me," or "I said something wrong," or "This relationship is falling apart." None of those verdicts were actually delivered by reality. They were delivered by you to yourself in under a second, and accepted without a single cross-examination. Cognitive behavioral therapy was built almost entirely around this exact distinction, decades after Epictetus first described it in a Roman lecture hall. Therapists call it identifying the automatic thought, then testing it against the evidence. The Stoics called it examining your judgments. Different vocabulary, same operation, same liberating result once you actually practice it instead of just nodding along with the idea. This doesn't mean every negative interpretation is wrong. Sometimes the verdict turns out to be accurate. The goal isn't forced optimism, it's accuracy. You're not trying to convince yourself everything is fine. You're trying to stop accepting unexamined verdicts as established fact simply because they arrived quickly and felt convincing in the moment they showed up. This is precisely where most people get the practice wrong on their first attempt. They hear, "Question the verdict," and assume it means replacing every hard thought with a comfortable one, which usually just produces a different kind of dishonesty rather than any real clarity. The actual discipline is closer to cross-examination than to comfort. You're not the defense attorney trying to win the case for your own peace of mind. You're the judge, asking both sides, the alarming verdict and the calmer alternative, to present their actual evidence before anything gets accepted as settled. Try this the next time a thought hits hard. Ask yourself what actually happened in one plain sentence with no adjectives. Then ask separately, what story did I just attach to that? Write both down if you can. Most people are startled by how thin the actual event looks once it's been peeled away from the dramatic narrative wrapped around it. This habit gets sharper with use, the same way a craftsman's eye gets sharper for flaws the longer they spend examining material. The first few times, separating event from verdict will feel slow and deliberate, almost like translating a foreign language one clumsy word at a time. Eventually it becomes nearly instant. The verdict shows up, and a quieter, faster part of your mind has already flagged it as unverified before the emotional reaction has fully built any momentum behind it. A useful test to apply once you've separated the two. Ask whether the verdict you attached is the only possible interpretation of the event, or simply the first one your mind happened to reach for. A friend cancels plans last minute. One verdict says they don't value the friendship. Another, equally plausible verdict says they're overwhelmed and barely keeping their own week together. Both explain the same fact. Only one of them was actually chosen by evidence rather than by habit, and most people never even notice there was a choice involved. This practice quietly reshapes far more than individual moments over time. People who consistently question their own verdicts tend to develop a kind of resilience that looks, from the outside, almost like nothing affects them. It isn't that nothing affects them. It's that fewer events get automatically promoted into catastrophic verdicts before being examined, which means far fewer ordinary moments ever get the chance to ruin an entire afternoon in the first place. There's a difference worth noting between questioning a verdict and dismissing a feeling. You're not telling yourself the disappointment isn't real or that the frustration doesn't matter. You're simply refusing to let an unexamined verdict, the kind that arrives fully formed and demands immediate belief, decide how big that real feeling is allowed to become or how long it's allowed to occupy the rest of your day uncontested. Drop "I question the verdict" in the comments if you just caught yourself treating an interpretation as a fact. Practice 3. Replace the story with the fact. The mind is a storyteller first and a recorder of reality second, which is a useful trait for surviving uncertainty and a dangerous one for staying emotionally stable. Give it a single ambiguous fact, and it will, within seconds, construct an entire narrative complete with motives, consequences, and a tidy moral about your own worth. Most of it invented, none of it verified, all of it felt as completely true the moment it's been written. A co-worker walks past without saying hello. The fact is exactly that. No greeting occurred. The story that often follows within half a second includes an entire subplot about being disliked, excluded, or somehow at fault for a relationship quietly souring. The story gets felt in the body immediately. The fact, by comparison, barely registers any emotional weight at all, because facts on their own are almost always less dramatic than the stories built on top of them. The Stoics practiced something close to journalistic discipline whenever a disturbing event needed to be examined, stripping it down to its plainest possible description before allowing any emotional reaction to take hold. Strip away the surrounding tragedy, the injustice, the meaning. Those are additions made by the mind afterward, not facts delivered by the event itself. This wasn't coldness. It was precision, used deliberately to prevent the imagination from manufacturing more suffering than the situation actually contained. Epictetus said, "Don't explain a thing to yourself as worse than it actually is." That's precisely where suffering begins. The practice translates easily into daily life. Whenever a thought arrives with heavy emotional charge, try writing the bare fact first, in the driest possible language, as if you were reporting it to someone with zero context and zero stake in the outcome. Then notice everything else attached to it, every assumption, every prediction, every character judgment, and set that part aside as a separate, unverified category, labeled clearly as story rather than fact. This single habit, practiced consistently, does something remarkable to a mind that's been running on unexamined narrative for years. It doesn't eliminate difficult emotions. It removes the unnecessary extra layer most people add on top of those emotions without realizing it, the layer built entirely from speculation dressed up as certainty. Relationships in particular suffer enormously from this confusion between fact and story. A partner comes home quieter than usual. The fact is simply that less talking than average tonight. The story that often follows, fully formed within seconds, might include suspicions about the relationship, assumptions about having done something wrong, or a quiet conviction that things are falling apart. Most arguments that start with, "You've been distant lately," are actually arguments about an unverified story, not about the plain fact that triggered it. And most of them could be resolved in a sentence if the story were named out loud as a guess instead of presented as an accusation. The workplace runs on this same confusion at a larger scale. A delayed reply from a manager becomes a story about being on thin ice. A meeting moved an hour earlier becomes a story about a hidden problem nobody's mentioning yet. Most professional anxiety isn't actually built from facts at all. It's built almost entirely from stories quietly constructed around an absence of information, which the mind treats as a blank canvas and fills in with whatever fear happens to be loudest that week. There's a reliable way to catch yourself mid-story before it fully takes hold. Notice the word definitely or obviously showing up anywhere in your own internal narration about an ambiguous situation. Facts rarely need that kind of certainty attached to them. A fact simply is what it is, with no persuading required. A story, on the other hand, often needs to insist on its own certainty precisely because some part of the mind already suspects it hasn't actually been verified. This same separation works in reverse too, and it's worth using deliberately on good days as well as bad ones. Notice a compliment, and the fact is simply that specific words said once. The story that follows can either inflate it into permanent proof of worth or, just as often, shrink it down to nothing with, "they were just being polite." Neither extra layer was delivered by the event. Both were added afterward, the same way every other story in this practice gets added, quietly, quickly, and almost always without permission. Try it on the next minor irritation that hits you today. One sentence for the fact, a separate, clearly labeled sentence for the story your mind built on top of it. The gap between the two sentences is usually where most of your unnecessary suffering has been quietly living. Type, "I separate fact from story" below if this just exposed a narrative you've been treating as truth for way too long. Practice 4. Use the pause before the reaction. Between a thought and a reaction, there's a gap most people never notice exists, because their nervous system has spent years training itself to close that gap as fast as possible. Insult triggers retort. Fear triggers flight. Disappointment triggers a sharp word that can't be taken back 5 seconds after it's already left the room. The faster the gap closes, the less actual choice is involved in anything a person does or says. The Stoics trained themselves deliberately to widen that gap, not by suppressing the initial reaction, which arrives automatically and isn't fully under conscious control, but by inserting a deliberate pause before acting on whatever that reaction was urging them to do. Epictetus described this almost like a customs checkpoint at a border. Every impulse gets stopped, briefly inspected, and only then either allowed through or turned back, instead of waved through automatically just because it showed up wearing a convincing emotional uniform. Seneca said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." This single habit alone, practiced consistently, prevents an enormous percentage of the regret most people accumulate over a lifetime. Nearly every message someone wishes they hadn't sent, every relationship damaged beyond easy repair, every decision made in a single overheated moment traces back to a closed gap, a reaction allowed to act before it was ever actually examined. The pause doesn't need to be long to be effective. Even a handful of slow breaths, taken deliberately before responding to anything that triggered a strong reaction, is often enough to let the initial surge of adrenaline settle just enough for a more considered response to take over the controls. 3 seconds of silence has ended more arguments than any clever rebuttal ever has. This practice gets dramatically easier once you've already built the habit from practice 1, catching the thought as it arrives. You can't pause before a reaction you never noticed happening in the first place. The two practices work together, one feeding directly into the other, building a kind of internal early warning system that gets faster and more automatic the longer you keep training it. There's a physical dimension to this practice worth understanding, because it explains why a pause works even when willpower alone often fails. A strong emotional surge floods the body with chemicals that peak quickly and then begin to subside within roughly 90 seconds if nothing further feeds them. The pause isn't a trick of willpower fighting against the body. It's simply waiting out a chemical wave that was always going to pass on its own and choosing not to act while standing in the middle of it. This practice has an unglamorous but extremely practical version worth adopting immediately for anything written. Never send the message, the email, or the comment the same minute you wrote it while upset. Save it as a draft. Walk away for 10 minutes doing something physical and read it again before sending. The version of you who wrote it in the heat of the moment and the version of you who rereads it 10 minutes later are, for practical purposes, 2 different authors, and the second one is almost always the better editor of the first one's work. The pause also has a long-term effect that's easy to miss while you're focused only on the immediate situation. Every time you successfully pause instead of reacting, you're proving something to your own nervous system, that the urge, however intense it felt, didn't actually require instant obedience to survive. Over enough repetitions, the nervous system itself starts to calm down faster, expecting the pause rather than fighting against it, the same way a dog eventually stops barking at the doorbell once it learns the doorbell was never actually a threat in the first place. Try this the next time you feel the pull toward an instant reaction. Name the urge silently to yourself. This is the urge to snap back, or this is the urge to panic, and let 3 full breaths pass before you do anything else. The urge rarely disappears immediately. It just loses enough velocity that you, rather than the urge, get to decide what happens next. Comment, "I pause before I react." If you can already think of a moment this week, this would have completely changed the outcome. Practice 5. Name it precisely, and it loses its grip. A vague feeling has far more power over you than a precisely named one, and almost nobody realizes how much of their daily suffering comes from refusing to do the simple work of naming what's actually happening inside them. "I feel off" can mean 100 different things, and because it means everything at once, it tends to color an entire day gray. "I feel a tight, anxious knot about the meeting at 3 o'clock" is a completely different experience to carry, even though it might be describing the exact same physical sensation. Marcus Aurelius practiced something close to clinical precision whenever a disturbing thought or feeling arrived. He'd strip away every vague, dramatic label the mind instinctively reached for, and force himself to describe the bare components underneath instead. Not "this is a catastrophe," but specifically what muscles were tense, what exact prediction was running, what precise word was doing all the emotional damage. He treated imprecision itself as a kind of intellectual laziness that fear was depending on to stay large. Modern research on something called affect labeling backs this up almost exactly. Studies using brain imaging have found that simply naming an emotion accurately, putting 1 or 2 specific accurate words on it rather than leaving it as a vague cloud, measurably reduces activity in the brain's alarm centers within seconds. The mind seems to calm down slightly the instant it's given a clear label to work with, the same way a frightened child settles a little once someone says the word for what's actually scaring them instead of leaving it nameless in the dark. Marcus Aurelius said, "Strip away the legend that encrusts a thing and see it plainly for exactly what it is." Most people skip straight past naming and go directly to reacting, which is exactly backwards. The vague version of a feeling, "I'm stressed," "today is bad," "something feels wrong," gives the mind nothing specific to work with, so it fills in the blank with the worst available story by default. A precise label does the opposite. It shrinks the feeling down to a size that can actually be examined, handled, and in most cases, resolved far faster than the vague version ever could be. Try this the next time a heavy feeling shows up uninvited. Instead of accepting the first vague word your mind offers, push for 2 or 3 more specific layers underneath it. Not anxious. Anxious about exactly what, specifically, in what part of the body, predicting exactly what outcome. The more precise the label, the smaller and more manageable the feeling tends to become almost immediately, simply from being looked at clearly instead of being left as an undefined cloud hanging over the rest of your day. This skill is especially valuable in conversations with other people, not just in private reflection. Telling someone, "I felt dismissed when you cut me off mid-sentence," lands completely differently than telling them, "You always make me feel bad," and it's far more likely to actually be heard because it gives the other person something specific to respond to instead of a vague accusation to defend against. Precision doesn't just calm your own mind, it tends to de-escalate the people around you as well. Build a small personal vocabulary for this over time. Most people only have a handful of words available for difficult feelings: stressed, anxious, upset, fine, and reach for the same one repeatedly regardless of what's actually happening underneath it. Spend a week deliberately reaching for more specific words instead: unsettled, depleted, on edge, disappointed, overstretched. The wider the vocabulary, the more precisely a feeling can be named, and the more precisely it's named, the faster it tends to lose its grip on the rest of your day. This practice also quietly improves something most people never think to connect it to: decision-making. A decision made while a feeling is still vague and unnamed tends to get colored entirely by that unnamed feeling, without anyone realizing it's happening. Name the feeling specifically first. I'm running on very little sleep and feeling impatient. And the decision that follows usually looks noticeably different, because the feeling has been separated out from the choice, instead of quietly steering it from the driver's seat the whole time. Children pick this skill up almost instantly once it's modeled for them, which says something important about how natural it actually is, even though most adults have lost the habit somewhere along the way. A child who's told, "You're not bad, you're just tired and hungry right now," usually calms down within minutes, simply because the vague, overwhelming cloud of "everything is wrong" has been replaced with two specific, fixable things. Adults respond to the same precision the exact same way. We just rarely extend it to ourselves. This isn't about overthinking every emotion into a research paper. It's a quick, deliberate habit, a few seconds of precise naming instead of a few hours of vague dread. The dread was never actually about the whole day. It was almost always about one specific, nameable thing that simply hadn't been named yet. Comment, "I name it precisely," if you just realized you've been calling a specific, manageable feeling by a much bigger, scarier name than it actually deserved. Practice 6. Close the mental loop before sleep. The mind doesn't switch off at the end of the day simply because the body lies down. Unresolved thoughts, left open like browser tabs nobody closed, keep quietly running in the background, surfacing as racing thoughts at midnight, restless half-sleep, or the particular exhaustion of waking up having technically slept but never actually having rested. Most people accept this as an unavoidable part of having a busy life. It isn't. It's the predictable result of never deliberately closing the loops the day opened. Seneca practiced a nightly review specifically designed to close these loops before they had a chance to run unsupervised through the night. He'd ask himself a short series of direct questions. What did I do well today? What did I do poorly? What would I handle differently tomorrow? And then, deliberately, set the day down once those questions had been answered honestly. The point wasn't harsh self-judgment, it was closure. A day examined and filed away is far less likely to keep tapping on the mind's shoulder at 3 in the morning, demanding unfinished attention. Seneca said, "When the lamp is put out and my wife has fallen silent, I examine my entire day and retrace what I've done and said." Most unresolved thoughts that surface at night aren't actually asking to be solved right then. They're asking to be acknowledged. The mind, in the absence of a deliberate closing ritual, tends to keep raising the same unresolved item over and over, the way a child keeps tugging a sleeve until someone finally looks at them directly. A brief, honest review at the end of the day, even 5 unhurried minutes, often satisfies that need for acknowledgement far more effectively than hours of unconscious tossing and turning ever could. The practice itself doesn't need to be elaborate. Before sleep, ask yourself plainly what's still unresolved from today. Name it specifically rather than vaguely. Decide what the very next concrete step will be whenever you next address it, and then deliberately set it down with that plan attached. You're not solving it tonight. You're simply telling your own mind, clearly enough to be believed, that it's been seen and that it has a place to go tomorrow, which is usually all it was actually asking for. Keep this practice brief on purpose. The goal is closure, not another extended thinking session disguised as a healthy ritual. 5 honest minutes accomplishes what hours of unstructured worry never manages to. A clear stopping point, named out loud or written down, after which the mind has explicit permission to actually rest instead of quietly continuing the conversation without you in a half-asleep loop that leaves you more tired by morning than you were the night before. Writing this review down, rather than only thinking it, makes a noticeable difference for most people. A thought that's only been turned over silently tends to feel unfinished, no matter how many times it's reviewed, because the mind has no clear evidence the matter was ever actually closed. A few lines on paper or in a notes app gives the mind something concrete to point to, proof available to check again tomorrow if needed that the day really has been examined and set down rather than simply abandoned mid-thought. There's a final detail worth adding to this practice that most people skip. End the review on something that actually went right, however small. Not as forced positivity, but as plain accuracy. Almost every day contains at least one moment worth genuinely noting, and ending the mental loop there, rather than on the day's unresolved item, gives the mind a calmer final note to carry into sleep instead of the sharpest, most unfinished thought of the day. This practice ties every other one on this list together. You've caught the thought, questioned its verdict, separated fact from story, paused before reacting, and named the feeling precisely instead of leaving it vague. Closing the loop at night is simply the practice of putting all of that work to bed properly, instead of leaving the day's unfinished business to run wild while you're no longer awake to supervise it. Last one. Type, "I close the loop," and notice how different tonight feels compared to the version of you who used to carry every unfinished thought straight into bed. 6 practices, not 6 things to memorize and forget by tomorrow afternoon, but 6 deliberate points of intervention in a process that's been running unsupervised for most of your life. Catching the thought before it catches you, questioning the verdict instead of accepting it as fact. Separating the plain fact from the dramatic story built on top of it, using the pause before letting a reaction speak for you, naming the feeling precisely instead of leaving it as a vague cloud the mind fills in with fear, closing the mental loop before sleep instead of carrying the day's unfinished business into the night. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca never had access to therapy language or neuroscience research. What they had was repeated, deliberate practice and a level of internal discipline most people today have never had much reason to develop, because most people today have never been forced to discover where the actual edge of their own control begins and ends. You don't need a crisis to discover that edge. You can find it deliberately, starting today, one practice at a time, in moments that feel far smaller than philosophy. A frustrating email, a sleepless worry, an old grudge that's been running on a loop for years without your permission ever actually being asked for again. It's worth being honest about how this actually unfolds, because most people expect transformation and instead get something quieter and more useful. You won't wake up tomorrow with a completely different mind. What you'll likely notice first is something smaller. A single moment, maybe 3 or 4 days from now, where you catch yourself mid-spiral and think, almost with surprise, I don't have to follow this one. That single moment, repeated enough times across enough weeks, is the entire transformation. It just never announces itself as one while it's happening. Think back to how you felt at the very start of this video. Somewhere in the last several minutes, a thought arrived, got noticed, maybe got questioned, and might already be losing a little of the grip it had an hour ago. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a small thing. That's the entire system already beginning to work, in real time, before you've even finished watching the proof of how it operates. Pick one practice from this list, the one that stung the most while you were listening, and run it deliberately for the next 7 days before adding a second one. This isn't a list to master overnight. It's a discipline to build the same way every other form of strength gets built, slowly, repeatedly, until what once required effort simply becomes how your mind operates by default. There's no certification at the end of this, no finish line where the mind stops producing difficult thoughts altogether. Even Epictetus, with everything he understood, almost certainly still had moments where an unwanted thought arrived uninvited and tried to take the steering wheel. The difference a practice like this builds isn't the absence of difficult thoughts. It's the presence of a trained, reliable response waiting right there to meet them every single time, instead of being caught off guard the way most of the world still is. 6 practices built in the right order form something closer to a single reflex than 6 separate skills: notice, question, separate, pause, name, and close. Run the sequence enough times on small, low-stakes moments, and it'll already be running on its own the day a genuinely difficult one finally arrives. Years from now, the actual measure of this won't be how many of these 6 phrases you can recite. It'll be something far quieter: how differently an ordinary hard day actually feels to live through. Same difficult email, same disappointing news, same sleepless worry showing up uninvited at midnight. Completely different person on the receiving end of it, simply because that person spent real time training the gap between the thought and what gets to happen next. If this reached you exactly when you needed it, hit that like button, drop a comment below with the practice you're starting with today, and share this with the one person in your life who's still letting their thoughts run the entire show. Subscribe for more of this, and remember, the mind that learns to govern itself is the only mind that's ever truly free.